All right, we're live. So, hi everyone. I'm Kent, and I'm here with Sarah. Say hi, Sarah.
Hi.
And Sarah is a CSS extraordinaire, animations galore, and awesome SVG stuff. Lots of really cool web things. And I recently have fallen in love with Aphrodite, which is a solution for CSS and JS, that kind of movement. And Sarah has a couple reservations on the idea of CSS and JS, and so I'm really curious to talk with her about what I might be missing using Aphrodite. So that's what we're going to chat about.
Yeah, actually, I'm more familiar with. So I should say that I do work with JavaScript mostly these days, but I did manage a giant CSS kind of system. um, so um, yeah, I guess I'm more familiar with CSS modules than Aphrodite. Can you give me a little bit of background on Aphrodite, please?
Yeah, sure. So Aphrodite is so awesome. It basically you do all of your styles in JavaScript, and then you take this JavaScript object that where the key name is the property name for the CSS and the value is the value for the CSS, and then you pass it into Aphrodite's API to create a style sheet out of that. And then what you get back is this special object that you can pass yet again to another API where it will actually inject those styles into the DOM. And then what you get back from that second API is the class name. And then you apply that class name to the element. So in a React context, you normally would call that second API in the render method. And yeah, and then generally you just create the styles like as a sibling as a sibling to the React component definition. So I can actually show a code example if that would be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. That would be awesome.
Sure. Let me pull that up. So here is just the Aphrodite README. So you import, oh, this is the server rendering stuff. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so you import the style sheet. And I should mention also that Aphrodite doesn't at all depend on, I should make this big. Aphrodite doesn't depend on React at all. It just works really well with React, but you can use like regular HTML stuff. So yeah, so you import style sheet and CSS from Aphrodite, and then you use style sheet to create a style sheet where you start with like your root properties, like these are the different components that you're trying to style, or I guess there are things that you can get out, like it's the object inside of here that's the styles. And you can even do media queries in here and pseudo states, pseudo elements. And then the styles object is what you use in your render method here. And you pass that to that second API called CSS. And this is where it actually injects the styles into the DOM. And it does it in a way that like it buffers these injections, so it only has to do an update once.
Okay.
But you can kind of compose these things together, and what you get back is the class name that you can apply to your element. So that's
So,
basically the API.
so when it actually compiles down, what the browser sees is a class name with a style, not an inline style. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep, and that's why I think it's okay to use Aphrodite because like the other stop. All the other solutions, or the really popular ones, are doing JavaScript hacks to make pseudo states and media queries work. CSS modules is cool because it like generates actual CSS, but it's not really CSS and JS. It solves lots of the same problems, but it also is dependent on a build system of some kind. I think Browserify supports it now, and PostCSS, I guess, maybe supports it. Webpack supports it. That's what I used it with.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't like the idea of enforcing that on my application or on users of libraries that I develop. Aphrodite has no dependencies. It doesn't require like any AST transform. It works with ES5. Yeah, it's pretty small. It's 6K gzipped. So
Nice.
it can also you can tie it into a build system to generate a CSS file, and so like then you can get the caching as well.
Oh, okay.
So.
See, I think it does actually take care of a lot of the things that kind of gives me pause, but a couple that we didn't cover. So typically, like the reason that I see people using inline styles or CSS, I like CSS modules. I think that they're really nice to like scope things within that kind of that like React Create class. But the problems that I see is that people are thinking about writing and not thinking about maintenance. And the reason why we invented CSS architectures to begin with were because of maintenance, not because we had a hard time. I mean, I think there was some things about writing CSS that people didn't like, which was like specificity and like dealing with these kind of collisions, and all of the inline style solutions for React tend to deal with those things, but they're only looking at one piece of the puzzle, and that is that in a year or 2 years, somebody's going to want to redesign and, you know, make your application look different. And as someone who's refactored a large system where people just like at the last minute want to change like the, you know, base color for the whole application, if you can change one variable and have that propagate through the whole system, I can't tell you like how like tears of joy as a developer for like, you know, it's like I like you change that variable in Sass and you're like, this just saved me probably weeks of work. Like I just know that it did. And if you're writing inline styles and things like that, you're not like keeping an eye on that whole system. And I guess the thing that I like about Aphrodite is that you're still basically, you know, writing CSS kind of, and it does seem like a good solution for that. But what I think that I'm not seeing there, which doesn't mean that it can't be done, is that type of architecture where you're keeping your variables different from the ways that it kind of propagates through. And I think probably you can do that, but it just seems like a lot of the system architecture of CSS, like if you're going to reinvent that way of working with those kind of component modules in CSS and Sass, I'm not sure I'm sold on not just writing those.
Yeah. So let me address that. That's a good point, and that actually is one other problem that I have with the other solutions. But let me share my screen again. So I've mostly been using this on JavaScript Air, the website, but we're using it at PayPal now. And cool thing about JavaScript Air is if we go to our source directory here, we'll have a styles directory. And in here we have variables. I don't have a whole bunch, but yeah, we have these variables, and we also have shared media queries as well. And this is super amazing to be able to like have all of these things predefined. And like because I'm using ES6 through this, let me see if I can find where this is being used. Here we go. But yeah, and I also have like a special like Babel alias thing going on here. And it's interesting because GitHub blows up with the way that I do that. So what that actually looks like is it says import these things from this alias, which like Babel will transpile into, you know, the relative require. But anyway, so here we have up to medium big, and because I'm using ES6, I can do this enhanced object literal thing with the calculated property name, and I don't have to care about what up to medium big means. I just say I want this to apply to anything that is up to, you know, medium big size, and if it gets bigger than that, then I don't want this to apply. And so it's very like, instead of having media queries spread throughout my code base, I have these variable names that just make a lot more sense. And so yeah, definitely I can see the concern of not having like being able to do variables or not doing variables, and I could see people not using them and just like hard coding these color values and stuff like that. But I think that you need the same type of what's the word I'm looking for? Like you need to adhere to the same type of thing in both
Yeah.
CSS and JS as well as JavaScript.
Yeah, and I guess I see like that you're setting it up similarly, but this is still not the type of scale of a lot of applications when they're fully built out. And I guess what I'm missing here is it looks very similar to the way that you would set up those components, and it's slightly more typing, and it's slightly more like context shifting a little bit, because I think, to some extent you're like, oh, well, I'm still in JS, so it's less context shifting. But really, if you're thinking about the styles for a giant application that you're trying to keep consistent across all platforms and keep consistent across every way that you're working with it, and you have a lot of people who don't feel comfortable with CSS, like for my own experiences there, I've worked on giant applications where a lot of the front-end engineers are not very comfortable writing styles and want to kind of like plug into things, and we can work a lot more quickly if I'm managing. If you have somebody who's looking over the giant architecture of the system, writing all of those things, and then that kind of abstracts away things to some extent where like the designers can pull just, this is this kind of button, this is this kind of form. Like, it really is like a modular component structure that they then don't have to think about again and again. And the nice thing about keeping those things separate is it allows for junior developers to work on a big system. It allows for us to work more quickly, and it keeps consistency across the application. If I'm writing something like an extend for, like if I'm thinking like, okay, I need forms basically to have the same look and feel as the buttons, and I'm extending that object and documenting that in one place where all of our documentation is kind of locked in a place where people can look at it. If you have like two different systems where you have like the variables in one place and then people are writing styles in another place, it still makes it harder, one, for the junior developers, and two, because you are kind of convoluting a lot of different things. Like their forms might look different from this person's forms, which might look different from this person's forms eventually. And so the problem that I see is more of an architectural problem, is like that you don't necessarily, there's like situations where that's great, but like a lot of times you don't want people writing their own styles for everything, and it to be just in like, sometimes the separation of concerns for those two things is a really nice thing. Just because, to keep your eyes on something that large is tough. It's really tough, especially when it comes to refactoring later.
Yeah, I think like this is just kind of it's a different way of thinking about things. I feel like Aphrodite has done the same for me that for CSS that React did for JavaScript and HTML. That it's like we're used to being able to share CSS by just saying plop this file in your project, and then you can use these classes and you document those classes. And I think the solution with Aphrodite is you say, okay, import this this project, like install this this module into your project, and then import these classes. And so it's just a different sharing mechanism, but you could still share styles for forms. And that kind of thing, and people could extend those things really easily because it's just JavaScript, and also like in the context of a bigger team where not everybody's using Aphrodite, maybe you can still build a CSS framework and people can integrate it and can use Aphrodite or not use Aphrodite and still use the CSS framework that you've developed. And so like, you want all your H1s to look the same. You don't want to have everybody use a special React component that contains all the styles or something. I actually saw recently from Max Strober. I can't remember his last name, but he was talking about on like with CSS modules. Somebody was asking that like, when is it the right time to use like the global option for CSS modules? And you said, what you actually should do is instead of like globally styling the input tag, you just create an input component that has all the styles, and then people use that instead. And I can see where they're coming from, but I'm not totally certain that's like that's totally awesome, because like you're enforcing something on somebody else, and I don't think that's especially when you're like building a library, or when you're building a you know a framework for several applications, not just one. And so actually I have another little fun thing to show you.
Okay.
This is a JS bin that combines Bootstrap and Aphrodite, and so it integrates really, really well. So I have my specific styles that I want, like for my application specifically, like the animations and the stuff, and like including media queries and stuff. But then I can also integrate it with Bootstrap classes by just adding those classes themselves. And so you could potentially, if you still want to build a framework using using like regular CSS and distribute that, because not everybody's going to be using the tool that you're using, then you can still do that, and then people in your organization could could use Aphrodite and still benefit from. I think like what the real value of Aphrodite, it comes to scoping down styles to a particular component, and so, or even a particular use of multiple components together. And so yeah, like I think for like application-wide things, I want all my H1s to look this way. Just use regular CSS for that. But for but honestly, I think that you can get most of the way there in an architecture using CSS and JS. You just have to think about it like it's JavaScript, because that's what it is. And so you import these variables, you can extend these things because it's JavaScript. Yeah, I think this is kind of an area that hasn't been totally explored, and it's kind of like React in the early days, where people are like, JSX is a really bad idea. This is not satisfying my separation of concerns thing, when in actuality, it's not a separations of concerns thing, it's a separations of technology. I feel like this is the same kind of idea.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with you. I think the reason why I have concerns is not just like, oh, don't stick CSS and JavaScript. I understand why people want to do that. And I actually like the way that we used to think about things does have to change if we're changing our technology. Like obviously, if you're going from a jQuery system to a React system, you're not going to be toggling things, like toggling classes as much to like change the styles. Like we do have to adapt to the way that we're working with things. What I am concerned with, that I think you're definitely addressing, is the idea of an overall CSS architecture. I think when I hear people talk about inline styles and React and CSS modules, that they think they're getting something for free is, oh, I don't have to worry about that collision anymore. And what I warn against, because I think, sure, again, writing, super easy. It's very easy to make something and just like, wow, this is easier to make. But then when I think about like, as your application grows, as there's more people working on it at different skill levels, as you have to maintain it in the future and have to re-architect that system, when people are thinking about it just in that term of like, oh, I just write the style right here, it's super simple, what they're throwing at, the baby that they're throwing out with that bathwater, is all of the work that we've done as a community to begin with, in the way that we were thinking about creating architectural systems for the front end. And if you're thinking about things correctly and building them out correctly with that Aphrodite system, or what, even with CSS modules, that's great. I think that that's awesome. But what I'm seeing is not that. And so like, I guess the concern that I have is less like that I don't think it's possible. It's more that I think that it tends to lend itself to not doing that. And I'm not sure that I want to be on the like, I'm kind of a gray area person. I'm never going to be like, everyone should be doing this, nobody should be doing this. I think the web is way too big to have that kind of type of thinking. There's like tons of different use cases and tons of different technologies, and everybody has a different brain. People like to build things in different ways. So I'm definitely not saying that everybody should just keep going the way that they've been going. But the thing that I would warn about to like a community that's moving more towards JavaScript is not thinking about that future maintenance problem, that there were a lot of good things that came out of those CSS architecture systems that like people don't want to look at because frankly, like CSS isn't cool. So they don't like want to think about any of the CSS kind of stuff. They just want to like, forget it, just give it to me. It's not a problem. But it's ignoring like a third of your code base. So like the problem being that like, even if you aren't into CSS because it's not hipster cool, you still should, as a good programmer, be thinking about all the things that you're talking about and thinking about, one of which being caching. Caching is a really big one. Even like I had a call with somebody who was helping me with their performance of their site, and we were digging into some of the CSS problems the other day, and they were like, oh, well, I just don't want to talk about or think about CSS. I'm not into CSS. And I'm like, that's understandable, but you have to. Like, if you want your front end application to load quickly and you have render blocking CSS, it doesn't matter if it's not cool to you. Like, you have to be thinking about it. And I guess I have that kind of same thought or feeling as I'm watching like the spaghetti code that we were worried so much about in JavaScript happen in CSS. It's like we gave up one for the other. So I guess like, no, none of Aphrodite looks awesome, and I do think it's slightly more typing, but maybe that doesn't matter so much. It's just a couple more quotes. You know, you get used to what you get used to. But yeah, I guess I'm still concerned with that you can set it up well, but until people create an example architecture for Aphrodite that people can maybe plug into and look at as an example, and the same thing with CSS modules, that the way that people will actually work with it will be very quick and will turn into this kind of giant, unraveling, hard to maintain structure.
Yeah, I think every new technology has kind of gone through that. I remember in the early days of Angular, well, even like with Backbone, it was like everybody built their own Backbone framework. And then with the early days of Angular, it was, okay, put all your controllers here, put all your directives here, put all your views here, and it like turned into a giant mess. And so like they worked through it, and now there's like a good architecture for Angular. Same thing with React, especially when Flex was the thing. It's like, oh my gosh, and everybody was building a bunch of stuff, like trying to figure out Flex. And then eventually, like we kind of settled on a couple of solutions. And so I think you're right. Like it's early days, and so people are going to be trying things and messing up for sure. And I agree. I think we need to have an example architecture. Like this is something that works, and that works really well. I know Khan Academy, who created Aphrodite, I imagine they've got something like that. And I'd love to see like some sort of design document or something. That would be really cool to see. I had a question though. Like you mentioned that you worry when you go to re-architect your CSS or something that you're going to have to go through all of your code base to like update everything, like because the CSS is kind of sprawling throughout your code base. And I wonder how different that is from just regular CSS, like because like it's the fact of the matter is that it's just in a different file. It's not like it's still going to be sprawling throughout your code base. The alternative being, of course, that you have like a single file for all the styles of this page, and then that comes with a whole other set of problems. But I'm curious, is that generally how? Like, how is that different, maybe?
Yeah, I guess like maybe it works better if we look at like SMA CSS or OCSS.
Could you describe what those are really quick?
Yeah, so maybe I'll pull up. So like object-oriented CSS or modular architecture for CSS, or actually like Google has like a web, what was it called? Now I don't have all of my quick bookmarks because I just switched computers.
Oh, yeah.
Google Web Fundamentals, I think is called, has these. Let's see if I can pull this up really fast.
I always feel like I'm like using crutches for a couple weeks when I get a new computer. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, it's awesome because I'm like, oh, I can set it up however I want. But I'm also like, all of my like quick and easy keys and things are gone. And I'm like, ah, okay. So think I mean, for those watching along, if you wanted to check that stuff out, I think that makes sense to look at these things.
yeah,
But
definitely
like
a good thing to learn about.
also like scalar modular CSS is a really good one to check out. I'm trying to find the.
Oh, well, I just remembered something. One other thing that's really important that Aphrodite supports is auto prefixing. So for
Oh,
vendor
that's
prefixing.
great. Yeah, I mean, that's a main reason for using it
Yeah,
too.
because lots of the
Um,
other CSS frameworks that do inline styles, yeah, they just like, yeah, there's not really an answer for that.
So I'm trying to find like a GitHub repo that we could look at together. But basically the premise is like you have your CSS kind of structured so that you have your variables, you have things scoped to mixins that are within themselves. Whenever you're extending something, you are thinking about it in terms of like these groups and components. You have a like base file that has the document, like living documentation for it within that file, skins that are applied on top of that, all within SCSS files, and then they're all really well organized and documented. So what you end up with is a compiled style sheet that you can use, that is minified and concatenated, and that you can pull things out of. I do think that it's totally possible and awesome to take those things and use them as CSS modules or something like that, but removing completely that structure, that initial structure where you have one organized place that's away from the place where you're using the styles, allows you to kind of maintain and keep an idea of how everything is laying out on the page and how everything applies in that system. It's much more organized because it's separated completely from the way that it comes about in the code base. And for sure there are points where like, things are different between the page and that, but it's very easy to debug for that reason because you have the living style guide. So you have the markup that creates those styles, and you can check between the code base and the actual code, like the CSS code base and the actual code and that documentation, that if the markup doesn't match, you're probably not going to render exactly the same, or there must be another style sheet or style that's being applied there that's messing things up. So by separating out those two concerns, you can keep an eye on like all of those ideas of kind of keeping things consistent across the application. But the other thing that you can see very easily is where those styles are coming from. If it's coming from a style that's outside of where you're pulling in the architecture, you know that someone's writing inline styles or writing things to override or something like that, and that's where things are getting messed up. So it keeps the concerns really kind of clean. And the other thing that it does is it allows for zero specificity. So you don't get into problems where you need things like important tags ever, because you are thinking about the whole system as you're writing the CSS. So I don't think it's the only way of going about it, but I've really enjoyed working with systems like that, even for smaller applications. Like I made 4 or 5 page websites where I use those kind of systems because it is so clean and neat and organized, and I'm a control freak and I like that, that like I'm able to keep my eye on what it forces you to do, actually. Even if you have to write something really quickly, it forces you to think about the implications of the way that you're architecting the system as you're writing the CSS. And it is self-documenting. And that the self-documenting, the kind of like living style guide stuff is pretty awesome if you're collaborating with a designer, because they can see right away, oh, like that wasn't really what we meant when we made this component. It needs to be doing this. And you don't have to like write a lot of other documentation in order to figure out your own system. It's all right there. So I guess I haven't seen that many living docs for that kind of, CSS and JavaScript, which does not mean that it can't exist. Again, it's like, I think what you're talking about is true. Like it's all these like kind of growing pains of doing a new thing, and over time things will emerge that are like that. I just kind of wonder if they're going to be exactly the same thing eventually. Like if eventually you're going to have living style guides for the CSS and React, if eventually you might be writing JSON that compiles to, something that it can be used like CSS, but then it's like CSS anyway. Like it's an object,
Yeah.
but it's like basically like CSS is,
out of that.
yeah, CSS is basically objects. So like, so I guess like the stuff that I think people are getting for free right now, there are concerns that I have on whether or not they're really that free. And
Yeah, there are definitely trade-offs, that's for sure. So I scheduled this for just a half hour. Do you have time? I still have some more questions if you have
oh
more
yeah,
time.
no, I have time. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, what you described, I think, yeah, could definitely be done and really easily with Aphrodite. It's just a matter of like people actually doing it, like you said. One nice thing about Aphrodite, if you were to go about doing that way, so like let's say we did the identical thing. We have the CSS version and the Aphrodite version, where it's just like Sass files and JavaScript files. And so the nice thing, or a couple of the challenges with that I have with CSS is that there's this implicit dependency between the CSS and the view, where you have to just make sure you're using the right class names, and there's no way to actually check that. Like I'm sure there are tools and things that you can run to say, okay, this markup is not using any class names that don't actually exist in the styles or something like that. But this is like extra tooling. So the nice thing with Aphrodite though is that I have a JavaScript file, and so I can import that file. I can import specific styles out of that, and then use those. And so then I have this explicit dependency between my styles and my components that are using the styles. A couple of really cool things fall out of that. One of them is unused styles are not loaded into the application. And so like I don't have to, like there are a whole bunch of tools to like check your application to make sure that you don't have any CSS that's not being used, because that's a real problem. You got to remove that old stuff. You're always wondering, is it safe to remove this CSS? But with Aphrodite, that question is answered immediately because you can see whether or not it's being imported. And so you never really need to worry about that. And even with the tree shaking stuff that's getting more popular, even if it's not being used, you don't care because it's tree shaken anyway. So that's one nice thing that kind of falls out of that. So like when I look at it and I see, okay, so we can do this in a Sass file, and like there's that special syntax for Sass, and that's fine. Or we can use it, do it in JavaScript, and we have like the whole language of JavaScript to use, and then we get these explicit dependencies between our components and the CSS that's styling them. To me, that appears to be like a really big gain to be able to use JavaScript itself and get that explicitness.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I'm just not sure that that's still not accomplishable with the same system. So like if imagine that you have the architecture that I was just explaining, and then you are using something like CSS modules or like Aphrodite or something like that with a system like that. I don't think that they're, you know, one or the other. So like if you're just or even just Sass can do this, to be honest. You can do @import button from blah blah blah, and you can just add in what you're needing. And also Gulp and Grunt have tasks that remove and clean CSS style. So like I do think that, like, yes, awesome, tree shaking, implicitly asking for things is really, really great. You're not loading a bunch of stuff that you don't need, but CSS has already like thought about a lot of these things too. The trouble that I see, so I think I'll say it this way. However you're gonna do it, to only add what you need is great. That's really, really great. And I think is really important for things like performance. What I have noticed is that even when you have like a lot of CSS like that and you compile, concatenate, and gzip, you're not actually making that big of a file anyway. And what's really nice is being able to cache that across your system and have it be asked for once. Once we have HTTP2, I think this will be a totally different story. A lot of these things will become anti-patterns. But until we're there, having that request be asked for once across the whole application and like explicitly cached so that it's not being asked for again for a very long time until something changes, that's kind of awesome. Especially if you've got people moving around across things. So I think it's great to have smaller style sheets per thing, but you should be thinking in terms of performance whether or not you have a 14 KB gzipped file and a 24 KB gzipped file, which, like, if you want a 14 on one page and a 10 on another page and a 5 on another page and a 10 on another page versus just that 24 KB and you're caching across the whole system, I think it's going to be different for everybody, whether or not that makes sense.
For sure.
Different use cases. Yeah. I used to work for Trulia, and we have a 2-page website, basically. We have, like, people go to search for a home, and then they go to look at the home. And they go to a couple of other pages, but mostly people are searching and looking at the property. And for us to, in that case, like, it makes a lot of sense to, either way does make sense because you have basically 2 style sheets or 1 style sheet. But if you have an application where people are moving across a lot of pages and like are checking out a lot of different types of things, I can definitely see a situation where maybe you're saving 10 kilobytes, but because you're asking for so many additional HTTP requests, it actually cancels itself out. So I think, like, when I'm thinking about all of these things, it's really like advocating for responsibility and understanding your architecture, even though CSS isn't cool. so like, you have to style things. That's just true. And
yeah, you have to deal with it.
You have to deal with this thing. I'm sorry, I'm your mom. I'm like super naggy. This is something that you're gonna have to deal with. Pretending, like putting your fingers in your ear and pretending it doesn't exist is like not gonna help. So the more that people are thinking about things in a responsible kind of maintenance mindset, like including things like performance, I think is good.
Yeah. This has been awesome. Thanks for chatting with me. I think if I could sum up, Aphrodite is awesome, and it solves lots of the concerns that you've had with CSS and JS, which is comforting to me because I'm totally all in on it. But we are going through the same kind of growing pains that React went through when it started, and so it's a great answer, but it's not the only answer. And good old-fashioned, well, not old-fashioned, the modern the CSS architecture things are really important to think about, even with Aphrodite. If I could sum it up, that's what it'd be.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think, like, something that I've proposed to other people working with CSS and React, especially like the systems that I think are really nice. Like if you have a CSS architecture and then you're using CSS modules to like basically import that stuff, that's like I think a kind of nice way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
But for all of these situations, what I would say is set up a perfect world scenario. Like setting up like what in your ideal world would be like, this is how it look like. Just take, I know that that takes a lot of time when people are like, okay, we need this product now, blah 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 blah, but I think it's one of those lost leader kind of situations where if you set up living documentation, if you set up like a nice architecture that is easy to add into, where people have to think a little bit about what they're writing before they write it instead of just, you know, willy-nilly writing it, setting up that perfect world scenario is probably going to help you down the line.
Yeah, I think it's just like testing. Like when product is saying, "Hey, hurry, 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 we got to get this thing done," you say like, you don't say, "Oh, I guess I can't do my testing." I don't have time to do that. And you don't have to tell, like, if they ask, you can explain, like, I will not do this without writing tests.
Right.
Just like I will not do this without, you know, using the right practices for CSS. I won't do it. And so fire me, but I'm not gonna sacrifice myself just because you didn't plan well, and we need to get this out now.
Yeah. And I think that
think
kind of
kind of falls in the same
negotiation,
thing.
oh, sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
I think that that kind of negotiation is important in general, kind of like just because the one time of like go go go, we just need this now, will turn into forever doing that sort of. I mean, I'm sounding like mean to product right now. I just think that that relationship between product and design and engineering, like people need to understand what's involved in order for them to even plan wisely for your work in the future. So setting the expectation that there is an architecture to manage and that that stuff is important, because otherwise technical debt accrues and you can't think about things as well. I'm really just advocating for, like, you know, garbage collection. It's like a little bit, you know, like as you do this stuff, it tends to garbage collect for you. Rather than just like accruing a mountain in a year when you need to like I just want to say to all the devs watching out there that like your designer will want to change things eventually. It just is true. Just like come to terms with that fact and like understand that you need to be making code that can be refactored.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Like code you can throw away, you can refactor. I love that you focus so much on maintainability. I think that's a really, really important skill that developers need to have, is focus on maintainability. So
cool. Well,
cool.
yeah,
Thanks,
I'm
Sarah.
actually going to go check out Aphrodite now. I think you stoked my interest. So cool.
Cool. Yeah. Let me know what you think. I'm definitely vested in this type of a solution. There's another solution that's similar that actually started, I think, around the same time. It's called Fella, Fella. It's a little bit different, but yeah, it's pretty similar. Even the API is pretty similar, so you could check that out too.
Cool. All right. Thanks for having me on, Kent.
Yeah, sure thing. See ya.
Bye.